It is 11:30 or half past the hour, depending on which hour you're at. So we want to go ahead and get started. Start the recording, Sharona?
Yes, it's recording.
All right, so I want to welcome everyone. This is the large class panel session. Resources and the schedule, of course, can be found at masterygrading.com. And then if you have any questions for our final panel, please join our Slack community and ask any of the questions in the help channel. I want to go ahead and post that Slack in the chat if anyone hasn't joined it already. So we are recording this meeting. We are planning to post recordings and slides so you can review them later. We retain the rights to rebroadcast and distribute these recordings. And by participating, you are agreeing that your contributions become part of this recording. This includes video, audio, and chat. As always, we want to give a big thanks to our sponsor, College Bridge, who's really made this and last year's conferences possible. So right now, this is our large class and coordinated class session. This session will be going on for an hour and 45 minutes. So this is the longer session. Some of your other options, if you choose, we have a panel on do's and don'ts, followed by a reassessment panel, and then a tech talk followed by I did a thing, which I think is one of the best names of any of our sessions.
Not correct, and not followed by. Both of those are simultaneous.
Oh, I'm sorry. A TED talk or a I did a thing. After this, we will be taking a little bit of a break before our town hall and wrap up sessions. So that's what the rest of today looks like. I am Robert Bosley. I am the moderator for this session. Now, this is a panel, but however, it is in the meeting meeting Zoom, not a webinar like most of our other panels are. So you do have control of your mutes, but we do ask that you remain mute while the presentation part or the introduction part is going on. And then afterwards, we ask that you use the raise hand function in your Zoom, and then wait to be called on to ask your question, just because we don't want 30 people trying to compete and ask questions at the same time. And panelists, I will be introducing you, and you will have 15 minutes to give a little bit of introduction of yourself and your background and talk about how you have done this in large courses. When I introduce you, I will ask that you let me know if you want me to continue running the shared screen or if you'd like me to turn it over so you can share your own screen. With that, are there any questions from the panelists before we get started on the logistics?
I just was wondering, can you turn off where it's beeping so much when people come in? I don't think I have control over that.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was set when the meeting was set up, but I think it's only the host and co-host can hear that. So sorry.
Okay. Turn it off, but I forget how.
I don't think I can turn it off once the meeting has been set, but I'll look at it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and with that being said, I want to turn this over to our first panelist, Hannah Bennett.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to let you share your screen, but that means I will be asking you to go to the next slide. So next slide, please. Hi, I'm Hannah Bennett. I'm a lecturer at the University of Michigan in the math department. I'm also a co-director of the intro program there. So this is 3 courses. Our course before calculus, which we don't call pre-calculus, it's also a terminal course where students learn a lot about using functions to model situations. So I'm going to talk about that one the most because that's where most of our mastery grading is happening right now. The program itself also has Calc 1 and Calc 2, and we are hoping to expand to those courses as well. These all have large enrollments of hundreds of students, and they're all designed to be very uniform in assessment. I love the way like class time works. So these are something very unusual about our program is that all of them are in very small sections. They're capped right now at 18 students. And we spend class time doing lots of active learning. You can see here a picture of me in one of our classrooms. So the students are sitting at tables. It's designed to make it really easy for them to work in groups. There's chalkboards all over the room. So class time is great. With hundreds of students and 18 students in a section, we have a lot of sections. So we have dozens of instructors. Most of those instructors are grad students, and a lot of them are postdocs. A few of them are lecturers, but that means that we have a ton of instructors because our grad students each have one section. And a lot of them are teaching either for the very first time or they're very new to teaching. So that definitely affects what we are able to do in our program. Next slide, please. Just to give you a visual of this, things have changed a little bit since this picture, but this gives you the size here. So on the, I'm bad at left and right, all the way on the left is 105. So you can see it's our smallest course. That's one of the reasons we started with that one. But smallest means 20 instructors and about 450 students. In the middle, we have 115. In the fall, that's our largest course. So that's Calc 1. That one has 70 instructors. It's not unusual for half of them to be teaching in the program for the first time, and about 1,600 students. So we want something we can scale to that as much as possible. All right, next slide. Okay, so where this started, it didn't actually entirely start with us saying, let's do mastery grading. It started with us saying, we want to do something to improve inclusion and equity in our classes. I think this is something everyone should be thinking about. I think in our society, right, there's lots of systemic racism, white supremacy, ableism. I'm trying to get better at actually using the specific words here. Lots of other forms of oppression and marginalization. And part of my job is to be thinking about where those things are showing up in our courses and trying to get better policies so that, and better teaching so that we can reduce these problems. One really nice thing about mastery grading is that you are thinking a lot about how your course is set up. And so it is a really excellent time for all of us to be thinking about this. If you're going to go and change everything anyway, you might as well also be thinking about how to make it more inclusive and more equitable. Not might as well, you should be. It's a thing we should all be doing. This is an ongoing process. I'm not saying I'm an expert in it. I am saying that it's important that we're all doing it. We've been pulling in people with expertise who work for our Center for Research on Teaching and Learning. If you're someone who's in the audience thinking, I want to do this, but I don't entirely know where to start, one book I've been reading that I would really recommend is this one, Asked and Answered, by Drs. Pamela Harris and Eris Winger. It's really good pretty much wherever you are in thinking about these things. It's a place to work through some of these ideas. All right, next slide. So in terms of our courses, here are some of the things we knew were issues. So we knew that inclusion and equity showed up in some of the ways things were being taught. So it's not just about the grading. So we're doing more inclusive teaching training for our instructors. But the really big things were the fact that the grades are based mostly on 3 really high stakes, high stress exams. We know that that tends to be a problem, especially for students who are already dealing with marginalized identities in other ways. We also, our grading system was really complicated, so I'm not going to show you what our old grading system looked like, but it was very hard for students to know how they were doing in the class or what they needed to do to succeed in the class. And it was designed in a way that had a little bit of competition between students. So their grade did depend a little bit on how the other students were doing. So we wanted to fix those things especially. And of course, whatever we ended up doing needed to work in these giant courses with dozens of instructors, many of them new, and hundreds of students. So in fall of 2018, we found ourselves with an opportunity where our dean actually said, you know, I want to give you support to work on these things, give me a proposal. And so one of my colleagues sent an email to the rest of us saying, okay, we need to brainstorm things. And I dug out the email I responded with. I'd been reading about mastery grading. So this is my response. I'm like, OMG, yes, I have ideas. So I was super excited because I'd been reading about mastery grading and just kept thinking about the ways that this was going to really address a lot of the things that were issues in our classes. I was totally convinced that I was like, reaching super high and okay, this isn't going to happen, but we'll do what we can. But like the things I said we were going to do, we pretty much did. So this is great. Okay, this is where we started. Next slide. So some of the things that were big problems in making this happen. The fact that it's a large coordinated course with lots of instructors means that we needed not just to get student buy-in, but also instructor buy-in. So if our instructors are going into their classrooms and telling their students things like, not everyone can succeed in this class, that's going to be a problem. So we needed training for them. We need as simple a structure as we can manage so everyone would understand it. We needed documentation that helped everyone know what was going on, but not so much that no one read it. And then of course, logistics, super complicated. I think anyone who's thinking about how would I do this in a big class is wondering, how do you do all this stuff? How do we keep track of progress for all these students? How do we handle the grading? How do we handle the grading in a consistent way? How do we do the reassessments? How do we write all these problems we need? Our solution for this partly came from the fact that we were already doing gateways, which were a small component of our course, but they were really being done in a mastery sort of way. So students reassessed until they reached a level that was considered proficiency. So we basically said, okay, we're going to take this gateway structure and use it more. And of course, the other challenge was to find a way to do this that wasn't going to overburden either the instructors or the coordinators. So next slide. So here are the details we ended up with. We have mastery assessments. We have 9 unit masteries, which are more or less a single chapter each of our textbook, and then 1 final mastery that is cumulative. Each of the unit masteries is 5 questions. It's built from a problem bank so that every time the students take it, they get slightly different questions or at least different versions of the questions. So the numbers change and that things change in a way that mean that the answer changes in a meaningful way, right? Like you can't just decide, oh, the answer to this is always going to be yes. You have to actually figure it out. Some of the problems are kind of routine, but I'll show you some examples and some of them are very conceptual. Students, we mostly set up a time limit to keep ourselves honest about making sure we weren't giving them too much work. So they have 30 minutes, no calculator or notes. We kept the numbers simple so that they didn't need those things. It was really about their understanding. When we were in person, we got a new computer lab to do this in so we could have them take proctored attempts in that lab. We only got to use that lab for half a semester and then we all went online. But on the other hand, it meant when we all went online, I already had these assessments online, so it was great. They get 2 proctored attempts a day. The assessments are open for about a week. They can practice as many times as they want from any computer. They can get help, they can read the solutions. So there's lots of opportunities for them to practice on this, but then their grade is based on what they do on these proctored masteries. To get credit towards their grade, for each problem, they have to get all the parts right to get credit for it. And then they have to get at least 4 of the 5 problems correct to get credit towards their grade. All right, next slide. So this is how that got turned then into a grade. So now we have lower stakes assessments because they can reassess and they're smaller chunks of information the students need to learn. And then this is how we turn it into a grade. It's a little bit complicated because we still have non-mastery-ish components here. But we ended up using language of points. If someone has a better word for this, I'm interested in hearing it. But basically, students both have to do well on the masteries. You can see the minimum points there for the masteries for letter grade, and they have to get a certain number of points on these other things as well. So things like team homework and section classwork, this is stuff where they're really learning. A lot of it is sort of completion based. And then there are a lot of things that we can't test on a computer, right? We can't ask them to explain things, and we do really want to ask them to explain things in this course. So that's showing up on these other assessments, especially the midterms. But you can see those total points cut off are very generous, so that even though, yes, the midterms aren't reassessable in quite the same way. If a student really doesn't do well on that first midterm for whatever reason, they can come back, do better on the second midterm, and still do quite well in the course. All right, next slide. What am I at for time? All right, so just quickly, here are some examples of problems. You can see the one in the upper left here is a problem in context. So thinking about these functions representing real world situations. The one on the right is one of the really hard problems because they get a different graph every time and they have to think about what transformation is getting them from one to the other. You can see all of these, none of these actually have numerical answers. They're all either enter a function or enter an interval or something along those lines. Okay, next slide. And then, as I said, we needed lots of supporting documentation so that everyone knew what was going on. So we have a student guide that explains what's going on. We've got a list of learning outcomes that we have available for students. One of my tasks for this summer is to sort of work on that and get better alignment between that and the mastery assessments. And just make it a little easier for students to see the connection, since it's not a specific standard. It's here's a list of things that corresponds to one chapter that they're doing at once. Okay, and this is where the consultants from CRLT were able to help us a lot with this stuff. Next slide. So how's it going? Well, our first time doing this was our second semester of the last school year. So we've only ever done this during a pandemic. So that, and I've only dealt with a pandemic while doing the mastery grading. That makes it a little hard to compare versions, but so far we've had lots of good things happening. We have done some things of asking students about their experiences, and what we're hearing is that they like the masteries, but not for like, oh, it's easier reasons, but for the kinds of reasons we want to be hearing. Things like, I feel less worried about the grade and more focused on figuring out the problem. Or this third quote here, I love this. You need to fail a little bit, and knowing that you can fail and it's not the end of the world, it makes me feel a lot better about learning. So these are the kinds of things we want students to be expressing, right? This growth mindset this approach seems to be helping with that. We did have more A's. We had way fewer D's and E's, at least in our second semesters of each year. In fact, everyone who stuck with the program in that first semester in the pandemic, everyone who stuck with the course and kept doing stuff managed to get at least a C, which was really impressive and really great. And the other thing is that, you know, I know people talk about rigor and stuff, but for this, especially at the C level, in order to earn a C, students had to demonstrate that they could do way more problems than we were doing before, when we were just giving them partial credit here and there and then trying to add up a bunch of points. So it's been really good for them to actually be able to completely do problems. And it's just been so much easier for dealing with a lot of pandemic stuff. So my colleagues working with big coordinated courses without this approach were having to figure out how to convert these giant important exams. And I was just like, okay, someone's sick, I'll reopen the assessment, you know, and I don't have to worry as much about cheating because, like, first of all, students can feel like, okay, I can go try it and see what happens. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't work. And secondly, they know that even if their classmates are cheating, it's not going to affect their grade. So they don't feel like they have to do this because everyone else is. Okay, last slide. All right, so a few more challenges we've encountered over the course of doing this. One of the big ones, since we have deadlines pretty early on for our masteries, it's been challenging getting students to start early enough. One of the big things we've done for that is something I call a mastery reflection assignment. So they have to do this in the first few days that the mastery is open. They go take it. They write down for me what they did wrong on each problem they missed. They submit it. They get credit just for doing it. It's a tiny piece of the grade, but it helps make sure they get started early and that they're learning from taking it. And then we also have a system we're partnering with at the university called eCoach that can send personalized nudges. So it finds out what their score is a few days before it's due. And then the student who's at 4 out of 5 gets a different message from a student who's at 2 out of 5, who gets a different message from a student who hasn't even started. the other problem with these early deadlines is, what about a student who's not quite there yet on some of those, or they have a bad week and just don't get it done? One thing we dealt with this was by reopening 2 masteries at the end of the semester, and that made it much easier to sort of make up for something that happened during the semester. I've also been pretty generous about reopening masteries for longer, because all I have to do is press a couple buttons. It's not that much work for me. And then finally, we are still feeling like there's quite a bit of focus from students about passing the masteries rather than like the learning the concepts. So we're still working on that. Getting a bigger problem bank than we have right now will help, because then it's not like, how do I do the table problem on Mastery 4? It's, how do I think about this concept? But that's one of the things I'm working on right now.
All right, thank you very much. Again, for those that might have questions for Hannah, please either put them in chat or just hang on to them until the end, and we should have plenty of time to ask questions to specific panelists or to the panel as a whole. Next up, we have a tandem from Cal State LA, Sylvia and Sharona, and I'll turn it over to you two ladies.
Thank you. Sylvia, you're muted. Not like I haven't said that 100 times.
Well, you know, you want to be a good citizen and be muting so you don't have all the noises in the background, and then you forget. But easy one to fix. So I'm a professor at Cal State LA, and Sharona is one of our adjunct instructors, but she's doing way more than a regular adjunct instructor. So to me, she's an honorary tenure track professor. But we met quite a few years back when I was sort of the informal coordinator of our statistics course, general education statistics course, which was a very, had, you know, 3, maybe 10 sections, nothing big. And the coordination was sort of minimal. And then Sharona was working on the SLAM program, where we had the statistics course at the high school. And so one day my chair came and said, well, you know, Sharona is taking over that SLAM program, so maybe you two should meet. And that really set off a whole journey. So I don't know, Sharona, whether you want to add something there.
I just want to add that that dual enrollment program was actually founded by Bosley. So that's how Bosley and I connected, was through the SLAM program as well. But why don't you tell them how we ended up having to make this a little bit bigger?
Well, so next slide, please.
No, not yet. Sorry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. You're
Yes.
right. I was on looking at somebody else.
So in 2017, so we're part of a 20 campus system, 21 large campus system, and the chancellor of the system said, we're not going to have remediation anymore. And we were a campus where there was half of the students had to do math remediation, and that was up to 3 courses in the quarter system or 2 courses in the semester system. And so saying we're not going to have remediation was a very big thing. So then there was a whole restructuring of the general education courses. And so Sharona and I became the co-coordinators of that quantitative reasoning course with statistics. And the chancellor's office put money behind this restructuring of these courses. And so we did also some alignment of our other general education course, and all of a sudden the statistics course boomed. And, you know, we have over 25 to 80 sections is not all the time, but we've had as many as 80 sections in a term. And typically they're between 10 to 25 instructors. So large number of instructors, and that all need to be on the same page. Now, like Hannah's classes, not quite as small. Our classes are between 25 and 30 students, but again, it's not the large 150 section course, but lots of small courses that all need to be aligned and uniform in some sense. So we were tasked with this changing the course, and then Sharona, I think now you should take over.
Right. So
Story.
when I was looking at this redesign, I had been doing mastery grading for a couple of years at this point, but I thought, I was the only one in the department. There's no way I was going to be able to get all these instructors on board. By the way, all of our instructors are either adjuncts or lecturers or graduate students. So we have no tenure lines who teach in this program. But then I blame Robert Talbert and PolyTeach. I went to PolyTeach in 2018 at Cal Poly Pomona. The theme was disruptive innovation, and Uri Treisman got up and said, the only type of innovation that sticks is disruptive and big. And Robert Talbert, who I'd known through Google Plus circles about mastery grading, was giving his flipped classroom workshop that day. And we met in person for the first time. And I came back and I said to Sylvia, sit down, because this is what we're going to do. And we started at that point our redesign from the perspective of we were going to do mastery grading, which I had a huge pit in my stomach. The course focus, which I think is really important when you're looking at mastery grading, is what do you want the course to accomplish? Our course is focused on making students critical consumers of data, not so much on producing or computing data. So we knew we wanted them to master the concepts of the use of statistics. This is actually a course that leads into what I would call like a sophomore level intro stats class.
And it depends. So since this is the non-STEM GE course, we have students that for whom this really is the terminal course. So they may be the art major, but then there are also programs where they will take a content course that's specific to the discipline, and or maybe the graduate program that they might go into will require a statistics course. And when we redesigned the course, there was a lot of complaints from the instructors in those discipline-specific courses that I said, well, the students come out of the statistics course we had, they can compute the mean and the median, so they can do computations, but they don't really know what these things mean. So we really thought, okay, and those instructors, and then we have to reteach them everything. So we thought, okay, given that there are students for whom this is terminal, and then students who get another statistics course where they either use more of the technology in terms of, SAS or other programs, having them understand what it means for them to be a consumer, to critically read, to say, well, what's behind this? What should we really look out for? That was what we settled on, because we thought that's really connecting this course to the student's life. So I think we can go to the next slide. So in our course, and we've gone through several iterations, and I think that's the theme. Linda Nielsen yesterday said, first time you write your specifications, you're not done. And we have had that experience where the first time we taught the course was in 2018, fall 2018. And it's been so long, it was all a blur. We had things arranged a little bit differently, a little bit more complicated, but right now we have basically 3 categories of things on which you need to have mastery. So there are the content standards, which tie to the course learning outcomes. And I think that's sort of what we always do, right? We have, these are the things the student should learn, but then we also have 2 other types of standards that the discipline-specific practice, which we call the mathematical practice, but if it's not math, whatever discipline, which have to do with not just the topics in this specific course, but more in the discipline. And this could be, how do you communicate in the discipline? Like, what notation do you use? Precision and use of units, writing of reports, maybe formatting graphs. There might be sort of things that cross several courses that have to do with discipline-specific knowledge. And so we have standards, 3 standards for that. So right now we have 11 content standards. We have the 3 mathematical practice standards. And then we had the things that, sort of good study habits, preparation, participation in class, practice afterwards. We used to have badges, and you had to have a certain level of points. So this is our only point standards in order to get badges. But then it was like, what if you didn't get a certain badge? The badges were the gateways to a C or a B or an A. And we felt that there were some philosophical issues with that. And so we wrapped that into one of our standards, and it has the same standing as the other standards, but it wraps up all these homework. We do clickers in class, that's the participation, and we have students do things before class. All that goes into that one standard. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I think for me, yes. So Sylvia is one of our coordinators, but she doesn't actually teach in the course. So I get to do this part of it. With this type of coordinated course, and a lot of this translates into if you just have a large number of students, some of the key pieces are having common assessments and common syllabi, and that is highly facilitated for us by the use of technology. We use Canvas extensively, and we use something called the Canvas Blueprint, where you have sort of a parent course, and you have all the children courses or sections or whatever you want to call it. And we push content from the parent course to all of the child courses in Canvas constantly, all the time. And we've trained our instructors on what can they do in Canvas and what should they not touch so as not to break it. Prior to the pandemic, we were doing all of our quizzing in class. Now, of course, going to the pandemic, we've gone to asynchronous quizzes, which definitely has been a benefit, and we're going to keep pieces of this. But assessments and assessment versioning is probably the hardest piece of these coordinated courses, because we do give a 48-hour window across what is sometimes as many as 2,000 students. So although the incentives to cheat in a mastery grading system are lowered, when you have that wide a window and you have students that are in multiple sections, there is some need for versioning and things like that. So we are, and if you are over in the Tech Talk, or if you watch it later, this is probably the biggest pain point we're still working with. We think we finally have a solution for generating many versions of similar types of problems, but especially in statistics, our problems are much more prose heavy, much more wording, and less of automatic math computation. The other really big key, and this is not just for mastery grading, but when you have this many graders or this many instructors, we do a lot of normed rubric grading. So our rubrics in the course are 4 levels. We have 2 levels that are mastery and 2 levels that are not. The reason we have 2 levels is to accommodate instructor preferences for feedback. So there's no difference between the 2 levels that we have that are mastery. One of them is called a check, one's a check plus. But we do have some instructors who feel very strongly that they want somewhere to go if a student goes above and beyond what is expected. And so we had to give them room to go there. And then the 2 masteries that are the 2 non-mastery levels are you're on your way, or you really didn't even give us enough to evaluate. So we wanted to be able to distinguish between those things. And what we do is we get together weekly as an instructor corps on Zoom. If someone can't make it, we record it. And we literally look at active student work that has been turned in on Canvas, and we grade it together. We grade maybe 5 or 6 problems on a given standard, and we come to an agreement on the difference between mastered and not mastered. And that's much easier to do and much quicker to do than in a multiple point problem. And Bosley and I often give examples in our intro talks where we ask people to grade a problem on a 10-point scale, and we get values of 1 to 9. And then when we ask them to grade the same work on a mastered, no mastered scale, we get about 75 or 80% agreement. And that's before we actually norm them. So we have these discussions, debates, arguments, I don't know, on what is a mastered one. Next slide, please. Is this Sylvia? Yeah.
So the getting anybody on board on the instructor or TA side to mastery grading is really, how did we all come to it? We talk about, and I have to back up a little bit apart from mastery grading. As part of this massive redesign of our GE courses, our Center for Effective Teaching offered AQ courses. So that's the Association of Colleges and Universities, EAQ, education.
College and university educators, yeah.
Educators, right? And so it was on teaching practices. And so being transparent, having a lot, learning outcomes aligned, active learning, etc. So a lot of our instructors have gone through that training, and that already gave a sort of a common understanding of what are good practices, what do we want to achieve on the course. And so I think in anything that you do at a large scale, that's really a very key feature, that you have a common language. And in our department, I would say it really made instructors and tenure line faculty a lot more a community as a whole. Before, instructors would come in, they have an office with multiple people, maybe they chat a little bit, and Sharon, I can tell you more about this, but it was not a community. And it was a place people came to work. We're a commuter campus, lots of our instructors teach at multiple places, but having this common training program that many that started it attended for at least one semester, many actually finished it a second semester. So we were all together, it was asynchronous, we were just having discussion boards. And so there was really common language, common understanding. And so when you want to get people on board, I think the question of, what does a grade mean? And should a student who has a slow start really be punished the whole semester in their grade for that? And shouldn't we really look at what do they know at the end? Isn't that what a grade should represent? And so having had already the AQ framework and then these discussions of why we wanted to do mastery grading was how to get the TAs or instructors in our case on board. And the norming and the rubrics was also something that we developed. We started it, but then we had several iterations where instructors said, well, this doesn't really is a good division from what we do, and the problems don't quite align. And so we had feedback and input from instructors into both the standards. So we've rewritten standards and also what belongs to a standard and how do we write questions that work for that. So we had a few instructors who said, not for me, and they now teach different courses, but we have a very stable core of instructors. And yes, we get new TAs in that start in the workshop and then teach, and then they're done with their program, so they go out. So we have a bunch of floaters, but we now also have a fairly stable core of instructors.
And along those lines, I just want to share that, for a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm going to have trouble getting people on board. We had a little bit of a carrot and a stick at the beginning. They kind of didn't have a lot of choice, but I kept expecting to start getting resistance because we've had some hiccups with grading load and stuff. And instead, every time one of my instructors now says, I have an idea, and my stomach gets a little tight because I'm worried that they're going to do some pushback. Instead, it's, I think we should rewrite our standards this way, or I have this idea for a problem that's better aligned. And I'm like so excited that, these instructors who've been working in the program for 2 or 3 years are now really beginning to contribute their own sense of mastery grading. And they haven't gone through anything other than what we've trained them in. So it's kind of exciting. Okay, next slide, I think, yeah. Is this one me, Sylvia? I don't remember. I think so.
Well, I can continue. So, and I mean, really, it's not a whole lot of different now in the coordinated courses because they're mostly adjunct instructors. There is a little bit more carrot and stick situation. If you have colleagues that are tenure track faculty and they go like, you mastery grading? No, I don't want that. I think really in anything, when you want to get anybody on board on a new idea, because we're all creatures of habit, and we're always more familiar and happy with the things we know how to do, even if they're not working so well, but we know how we do them. It's really having discussions and saying, again, the question about what's the grade. Do you want your students hunt for points, or do you really want them to want to learn? That's one thing. And then the other thing, once you've done mastery grading, you can talk about how your students have reacted to this. Like what Hannah had in terms of the student reflection and on how students responded to this. The other one is when you have a multi-course sequence, if your students who have gone through mastery grading, how do they do in the next course? And Sharona has taught in the calculus where she's done the mastery grading, and I think you can talk about those kind of experiences there.
We can, but I think we're close to the end of our 15 minutes,
Okay.
so I want to be respectful of the time and can certainly do that if people ask us.
Yeah.
I think that we can hand it over.
Yeah.
Oh, unmute. Thank you. Yeah, Robert, I'd like to do my own slides, actually.
All right, so let me go ahead and turn my share off, and then I will be turning this over to you, Deborah.
Okay, thank you. I just put some animations in. Why is that doing that? Oh, because I pushed present instead of share. Okay. All right, thank you. This is all the other panelists. This was really interesting and gives me a lot to think about. And some of this is a kind of a different situation here and a different level of experience that I have. So yeah, I taught a huge class. Let me tell you about it. I also presume that many of you have taught huge classes many more times than I have. But okay, so for 25 years, I taught at Wheelock College. And these are some pictures from my teaching at Wheelock. Wheelock came out of the kindergarten movement from the 19th century. It had active learning in its DNA. Using alternative assessments was really very supportive there. I've been doing it for years and years before we had a lot of these terms. And then 3 years ago, Wheelock merged with Boston University, and I joined the math and stats department at BU. And in the merger process, I tried to get it in writing that I would not have to teach really large classes. I did not succeed at that, hence I am here. So a bit about my class last semester. Oh, sorry, my animations aren't working quite like I wanted, but so it was the lowest numbered of the introductory stats classes at BU. I would not name it elementary statistics. I don't think it's elementary, but that was what it was called. It was remote synchronous at 8 a.m., which means effectively for many students, it was asynchronous because they were not going to come then. I had one graduate TA and 2 undergraduate learning assistants in the classes with me. They met twice a week with us all together, and then there were discussion sections that were led by the TA with one of the LAs in the class at the same time. There were 121 students at the end. And I also had 2 undergraduate graders who were paid for a total of 105 hours. So as you can easily see, that is less than 1 hour per student per semester. And so these are some of the things that I was thinking about in setting up this large class. And some of these are kind of different versions of things others have said in this panel and the whole conference. All right, so I actually think there's something kind of dehumanizing about this structure. And I have a very personal style with students, and we were in the midst of a global pandemic. So I wanted to, you know, as much as possible, still like kind of stay who I am in this context and have respect and compassion for students. It's very weird. I usually use PowerPoint, not Google Slides, and I seem to be getting two at a time with my bullet points. That's okay. You know, second, I really think about assessment a lot in terms of power. And so some of this is about transparency. How am I using my power as the instructor? Hannah talked about equity, which is very important to me. And then I think even a little more specifically, I've been reading a lot about the history of statistics and kind of the founding fathers, Galton, Pearson, Fisher. They were passionate eugenicists. And, you know, a lot of the material that, you know, the techniques that they developed were to support basically, you know, documenting why one group is better than another group or one individual is better than another individual, with very, very deadly consequences in terms of sterilizing people, inspiring Nazis, all of this sort of thing. So I really conceived, you know, in teaching intro stats, I was thinking about the assessment system in opposition to that legacy. And we find it all over stats. I mean, try to find a stats book that doesn't talk about SAT scores and things like that. So I had something in the syllabus about that history of statistics. Another thing I was really thinking about is trying to find intrinsic motivation. This was a required class for most of the students, but I thought, you know, in a pandemic where we're talking about data all the time, that there ought to be a way in for intrinsic motivation. And I think there was for many students. You know, I was kind of like, how the heck do you have community in this huge class? But at least that the assessment system would promote collaboration and not undermine community. You know, as we're talking about the whole conference, of course, wanting to try to align assessing what's valuable. I think in a class this huge, there is a temptation to assess what's easy to assess. And of course, supporting learning in the ways of students being able to learn from their mistakes and all the things we're talking about at this conference. All right, we're on this thing again where, oh, that is so weird that did that. I don't know, maybe somebody's helping me in the chat. I'm not seeing the chat. Okay, so, and then the last one was, you know, I had this sense that this class could destroy my life and I didn't want that to happen. And I was also supervising 5 students and I wanted to model boundaries and self-care for them as much as I could. So this was sort of the big frame that I used. And I ended up using percentages, which I really don't do very much. I did that for transparency. And you'll see within the categories, it's somewhat specifications, grading, and other kinds of things. But I wanted, I didn't want to do like bundles with specifications grading because I just thought there was potential for a lot of ambiguity that would just end up being too much work. So, you know, we can talk later about whether this is a good idea. I mean, Hannah, I saw in your slides that some of what you did was a little bit like this. And it also has the advantage of at least the shell of it being something that the students recognize. Okay, now within the categories, so there were these 4 categories and 3 of them were graded automatically. I used my open math. We don't have web work at BU. And so there was homework, which was usually introduced during the discussion section. And that was really a good faith effort, got you to pass on the homework. And then there were practice quizzes that were not included in any of the scoring. And then there were quizzes which were, you know, they were aligned with, you know, normal distribution chapter, whatever it was, or something like that. So, and basically the quizzes and the practice quizzes were mostly the same questions, just with different numbers. And so then they were converted to this kind of letter scale that was then converted to the standard sort of 4.0 scale. So then Perusal, I don't know if you're all familiar with Perusal, but it's a social reading app. And some of the students really loved it. Some really did not. And it has an algorithm built in for scoring, which is kind of like a whole other issue when you're talking about a class like this. But I have this, kind of ridiculously precise scale that's not exactly measuring anything quite meaningful, somewhat meaningful. But suffice it to say, it's generous. I mean, if students were more or less doing the readings, they could do well pretty easily. So those were the 3 automatically graded categories. And then what I used the people power for were these 3 explorations. So our class was a statistics literacy class, but I would say not at the level that Sharona and Sylvia were talking about. It was definitely an intro to stats class. And but for my mind, for this group of students, the main point of this class is so that they will think about data and statistics differently in context, in context that they care about. So trying to figure out how to actually assess some things that were like that, so that we could have this value, I could promote these values. So there were 3 explorations. These were assignments that they had some class time to do, including the whole class meeting. And the first one, so one of the advantages of having a really huge class for stats is, you can get a lot of data on themselves that they can actually do something with. So at the beginning of the semester, they designed a survey with a whole lot of questions about themselves. And so the first exploration, they were asking questions and descriptive statistics, making graphs, etc. But there was some agency in what they asked. The second of these explorations was, ripped from the news, talking about COVID, not the traumatic part so much, but really about sampling distributions, simulation. Can you put a bunch of, if you want to save money on testing, how many, and you're gonna pool samples and test them all together, what should the size of the pool be in order to save money? So this really went with things in the class. Also, false positive and negatives, when would the rapid tests be useful? Okay, so those were the first 2 explorations that just had greater feedback. The third one was our finale instead of a final exam. And I'll say a bit more about that soon, but let me talk a little more about the logistics of getting students feedback on these assignments. So they were scored pass or rewrite. The borderline was kind of, is there genuine learning in rewriting? And I spent several hours with the graders, 3 or 4 hours to kind of get on the same page. I did solicit their opinions. They were harsh sometimes, yeah, I think they should rewrite it. But they turned it in on Blackboard using Turnitin. So when I was with the graders, we also sort of made, kind of a bank of comments to use and just sort of worked out a system. And then after that, the graders did most of the work. They did triage. They left things that were complicated for some reason for me. If there were times we got really backed up, that I brought in the TA to help some. And even on exploration 2, I had one of the graders teach the TA how we were doing it. I also made videos for common mistakes. So like this little example is a graph of what form of social media do you use the most? And I had a bunch of students who put a curve on that and said it was a right skewed graph. So in a smaller class, I might have engaged with them differently, but in the big class, I kind of ended up making videos on these. And in terms of the rewrite, basically, on the first rewrite, in almost all cases, if it was better than the original, we passed them. We just really didn't have the infrastructure for multiple drafts with this many students. Okay, so now I'm talking about exploration 3. And this is something that ended up really great. So for exploration 3, they needed to read a research article that had p-values or confidence intervals in it, and it should be something they were really interested in. So there's a pretty, a lot of choices. And then I had a list of questions that really reviewed almost everything from the class to think about with respect to their article. Is it an observational study or an experiment? How was the sampling done? What are potential sources of bias? How do you interpret the p-value? All these kinds of things. And then what you're looking at is a screenshot of one of 4 Miro whiteboards where students uploaded their project to this. And then during the final exam time or asynchronously, they made comments on each other's. And it turned out I had a lot of humanities and communications majors and students who are really used to making comments. So their feedback was very thoughtful. And this was an advantage of a large class that I really hadn't considered, because I think one of the other things I would like students to see is that, wow, this stuff we studied in class is used all over the place. And they were kind of blown away by the variety. I mean, we had environmental racism in the Bronx, cryptocurrency, cannabis use, does X affect college students' sleep, and many more things. So this was something that was just pure feedback, and then they had a reflection form. And it's very possible that they made mistakes on some of the questions that I asked on the article, but I don't think that really took away from the major goals. I also had the first thing they had to write why they chose the article. And that was also really nice for community. Like, wow, these people that I'm going to school with are really interesting, and they're interested in a lot of things. All right, so a few things that I am pondering after having taught this large class once. Things I think some of the other speakers talked about too. Really challenging with the communication and organization. I felt like I was, trying to steer this humongous ship that I didn't really know how to steer and was hard to turn. I mentioned a couple of ways that the large class size proved to be an asset. I actually don't think we should have classes this big, and I would really rather not teach them. But if I am, are there other ways to leverage them? And, at Wheelock, I was the leader of the math program for like 20 years. So I'm really used to thinking programmatically. So I have been talking to some of my colleagues at BU about changing their assessment systems. And so it was really interesting for me to hear the other 2 talks. And, I've been thinking a lot also about, for me, I really come from the point of view of using assessment to support pedagogy. So I'm really interested in, can you change the assessment first? If people are lecturing, it just seems to me that the kinds of grading systems that the other speakers were talking about, even if people were lecturing, would be better than what they have right now. And that might be a first step. All right, thank you.
All right, so
I didn't read the chat at all. So if anybody was asking me something, sorry.
all right, so first I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists. Those are great presentations. We will be now moving to the Q&A portion of this panel discussion. I want to start off with a question that was asked in chat earlier by Renee. And this is to all the panelists. How do you get instructors and especially TAs on board when they did not choose to teach the course and would prefer not to be teaching at all? So open to any of the four that would like to lead this one off.
I have some thoughts, of course.
Please.
So this was definitely one of my big concerns because we were bringing this into our instructors were not used to coordination basically at all. So when we did these redesigns, not only were they coming into a new system, but they weren't used to having anyone tell them what to do other than handing them a syllabus. So I'm a big fan of as much combination of carrot, stick, and influence. So what I mean by that is I'm aware that with our instructors, we have the power of whether or not they have a job. So to some degree, there's that sort of power dynamic underlying all of this, and I'm trying to be aware of it. So the carrot was, let me do all the prep for you. Can I, let me try and hand you this thing where the only thing you have to do is put your own spin on it if you want to, but you can literally walk in, teach, and then really you're focusing your time on assessment. Because what we're starting to see is, and I think, Debbie, your question is very well taken. My impression is if you change the assessment, you start to get a lot of these benefits regardless of the pedagogical style. So whether my instructors were used to lecturing or they were used to active learning, like we could, now we did a lot of we did encourage the active learning and all that kind of thing. But I think if you could hand them something that is mostly thought through, and then you sit with them and explain your own experiences. So the fact that I literally go walking around, like I'm trying to get 2 of my tenure line faculty, other than Sylvia, to convert to the team-based inquiry learning algebra, linear algebra mastery grading. And basically I just keep raving about the conversations that I'm having with my students and how I'm having these aha math moments in the classroom because I'm so sick and tired of debating with students about their grades. So as someone, a TA who does not want to be there, hopefully is highly influenced by, well, don't you want to talk about this thing you're studying? Because if you do this, that's what you get to talk about. You don't have to talk about the grades and the points and the this. You get to talk about math or chemistry or engineering. So that's sort of the influence piece. So that's been my experience is you give them as much as you can so that they have to do the minimal cognitive load to start. You get them to try it. Hopefully they start to get some of these experiences of, oh my gosh, this is so much better. And for those of you who are worried about workload, it's very real, but I would argue the actual grading is much faster because you can look at something and you're going to know instantly if it's mastered or not mastered. The time comes in the feedback piece of it and in the generation of assessments. So there's ways to do some of that, but that's my 2 cents.
Couple of thoughts I would add to that. A lot of things that I would agree with there. Yeah, so talking about, the grading, also that I find the grading much more pleasant when it's mastery based than when I'm like counting points. One thing I did last year for our training, so we have a week-long training before the semester starts, was to ask our current grad students to tell me a little bit about their experience with teaching and like, how has your teaching helped you in other parts of grad school and stuff? So I could see asking the instructors who have done it questions like this and seeing if you can get answers that would be persuasive to reluctant instructors and sort of using that to help sell it. Well, there was one other thing. Oh yes, having the conversations about math also seems like is a really good one. Like you're going to spend your time teaching doing things that are actually fun rather than the more painful pieces. I try to push that idea too.
All right, Sylvia or Debbie, would either of you like to add to this? All right, and I do want to remind everyone that you guys are welcome to ask questions in the chat or to ask them out loud. Just ask that you raise the hand in Zoom first. We do have another question, and this is for the entire panel. What has been one of the largest barriers to implementing or maintaining mastery grading in a large setting, whether it's a single large class or in a coordinated environment. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Well, I would say it's the, especially with the number of students we deal with, keeping questions fresh and versioning. So while we got the standards and how we grade, I think we've settled on something that is, that works, the timing of reassessments for students to understand the scheme, etc. But to having reassessments and making sure that there are enough versions and next semester are not the same questions as this semester, that's been so far, I think, one of the bigger problems. But as Sharona mentioned, we think we'll have a solution for piggybacking on something where there's questions that are set up for mastery grading.
Would anyone else like to chime in on that?
I mean, I think for me, it was just, it's hard to sort out what was doing different pedagogy than they're used to and what was doing a different grading system than they're used to. But, I mean, I think one of the things that's hard since I've been at BU, the students are a lot more privileged than the students I had at Wheelock, and a lot of them are just really, really good at school. So there was a sense of some that, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it was just hard to explain because they've figured out school. Like I felt like at Wheelock, I had more students who, if I had students who got C's in math their whole life, it was a different challenge to say, you can do this and you can do well. And it was high expectations in a different kind of way. And so I think that communication, dealing with the LMS, trying to make it work so it wasn't communicating something that I didn't want to communicate. And then this thing that, I would say for a lot of the semester, my attendance was about half the class. And then by the end, it got down to about a third. And I just felt like there were some students who were going to just message me when anything went wrong. And it was just overwhelming. I mean, it was like I was afraid to turn on my computer. But I didn't want to be one of those people who say, do not message me or something, because, what I said about having a personal style. So I'm not sure that's a good answer because I don't have enough experience. Some of those might have been beginner things for me too.
Go ahead, Sharona.
Just tagging on what Sylvia said, writing the reassessments is one of our biggest barriers on the coordination side. Also, we have some instructors who go overboard on feedback. I mean, it's great for the students, let me be clear, but they were dying. And so and then I have other instructors who do a perfectly fine job of feedback, but they'll do a 30-person class and it'll take them an hour to get through their feedback. And someone else will do a 30-person class and it takes them 4 hours. And so helping instructors and coaching them on how to do effective feedback is also critical, because otherwise you run the risk of burning out your really good instructors because they are going so in depth in the feedback, and feedback's critical. So you don't want to have none of it, but you also, if my instructors teach 4 classes, so if they're doing 4 hours per assessment, that's 16 hours of grading every single week. It's just way too much.
Yeah.
All right, so another question for the entire panel from, I forgot where it came from. I apologize, I wrote it down, I forgot who it came from, but can the panel talk about how you manage reassessments? Do you use a token system, unlimited, a finite? How do you guys handle reassessments in these large or coordinated classes? Debbie, go, please.
I'll just say quick. I mean, what I put limits on it. I just said 3 times for the quizzes, although there were some students where I deleted one of the attempt for various good reasons. But Yeah, I didn't really have time limits on when they did them.
Sylvia?
Well, so what we have is we have an outside of class assignment, and then we have a quiz. And well, now in remote, everything is outside of class, but then there were 2 more reassessments. So some, had multiple standards as we went further along. So our masteries, you had to get twice mastery on a standard on 2 different assignments, either the check or the check plus. And so they had a total of 4 planned assignments and reassignments, so twice as many as they needed. And then there was also the final where all of the standards were offered and students could pick whatever they still needed to do. So we didn't have tokens. I think in one iteration we had some tokens, but it just became too complicated. And students, I think in some higher level classes, you might be able to do that. But again, these are mostly freshmen, so they're new to the university. They come maybe from high school where a lot of things were more structured, and now they have to deal with 5 classes. They have to make their own choices in some instances. And so we wanted to make it simple. And so we just had a fixed number, of attempts for each of the standards.
Sharona?
Just to tag on to that, I've taught this in a wide variety of classes now using basically the same structure, give or take, linear algebra, 3 calculus classes of pre-calc and stats. My experience, if I'm asking them to get mastery twice and they don't get it the first time by the 4th chance, they're not going to get it within the context of the 15 weeks. So, so basically, and I used to have many more attempts than that. And it really just, if they don't improve enough by the 4th attempt to start getting mastery, they typically don't improve enough during the 15 weeks to be able to do it at all.
In our courses, we're doing things a little bit differently. I think we ended up how we are because we already had these gateways in our courses that worked one way. And so we sort of modeled that situation where we have deadlines and that's it. And so they have to, they can take it quite a few times, but in a rather short period of time, twice a day for like a week. I'm thinking about it now, like actually the gateway system, we could set it up so they could only take it a certain amount of time over the semester. The problem is in like, I don't, so many of them were waiting until so late to take it at all, even when, the deadlines were early on. I'd be really hesitant to make it possible for them to keep putting it off longer because they just will do it and then they'll get in trouble because they won't have enough time to get stuff done.
Thank you. Our next question is specifically for the coordinated courses. So Hannah and Sylvia and Sharona. And the question is, do the instructors in the coordinated courses give their own letter grades, or do they give them based on a coordinated grading system as well?
So I actually just answered this in chat, but I'll go ahead and answer it out loud. We have a common grading scheme for the course. It's laid out in the syllabus, and because we're controlling the Canvas blueprint, it is literally the same for everything. So all instructors, they actually do the physical assigning in the final grading system, but they do it based on the common scheme. They can request to meet with us to suggest that a student should get a higher grade. So, but honestly, we haven't really had that happen, maybe once or twice. And then one of us would meet with that instructor and look at the student's record and agree, oh yes, they actually really should get this higher grade. But it's pretty straightforward because it's just, we've gotten super simple. 15 standards total in the class, 14 or more is an A, 13 is an A minus, 12 is a B plus, et cetera, down to C, and then we give a no credit. So it's super simple. Count your masteries. Whatever you have, that's your grade.
And the individual instructors record their mastery grades in their Canvas course for the student. And so the student does see how many standards have been mastered at any one time. And so we also created a little worksheet that showed them when they have reassessments for, and what type of, which standards are in which reassessments.
And we also, one of the things we were going for was to make it more set out in advance. So before we had a system that was mostly uniform and instructors could tweak things a little bit, and it was super complicated, and we wanted to sort of get rid of that. So instructors, again, do enter the grades themselves, but they do it based on the system that's set out, and it's the same for everyone.
Then have a more of a broader question rather than a technical question. So I definitely want to ask this, and this is to all the panelists. This is coming from David. It says that it seems like you guys, which are all champions for mastery grading, but you also had a level of influence at your institutes. What do you think it would take for these types of innovations to be diffused broadly when there's not someone with influence champion these?
My
Go
short
ahead,
answer is find a champion, because I was only allowed to do this because I got Sylvia on board. Even though I was originally hired actually as what was called a course specialist, and all of our coordinated courses had these course specialists that were adjuncts that were helping the coordinator. And it was just sort of me persuading Sylvia first, because I have no power. I mean, I was in my 3rd year teaching at the institution. I don't even know if I was on 1-year contract yet. I mean, I was pretty new. I had no influence, and technically I kind of still don't, because as an adjunct, I have no authorization to review instructors. So I don't have any retention, tenure, and promotion capabilities. Like, mine's entirely just personal influence. Sylvia is the one that actually has influence. Also because she taught.
I'm the one with the whip. No.
But also half of our instructors refuse to call her anything but Dr. Hoybach because they've been grad students in our program. So that's been really interesting, because I get sort of the more peer communications. And even though we have instructors who've been teaching in our institution for 23 years, who still treat her as a faculty member. So it's been really interesting. So that's my answer, is find a champion and persuade them.
So I guess that tells you how long I've been there. And so I think somebody who's been there for long, that has respect of the colleagues, who's like, okay, well, if she says it, there must be at least something worth trying, I think helps.
Yeah, I think champions are super helpful. I think also if there are other programs that are similar to yours, or that people in your program see as like a model, being able to point to them and saying, well, they're doing it, might also be helpful. So people talk about Michigan math quite a bit. So, Michigan math is doing it, I don't know, might be helpful.
I was paying attention to that, Hannah, because I'm someone who used to have influence. I mean, when I was at Wheelock, I had a huge amount of influence. I was a big fish in a small pond. And I mean, I lost tenure in the merger, and I have a certain amount of security, but I'm sort of entitled because of the position I used to be in. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't like that textbook. I don't want to use that. Is that okay with you? And, other people maybe wouldn't say that, and maybe wouldn't get away with it either. So there is a certain amount of privilege in that, and going with my academic credentials and all of that. But honestly, that's the question I'm trying to figure out. I mean, we have coordinated stats classes too. And, when I had to do this large class, the department chair really thought I would want this coordinated calculus class. He said, you don't have to write the quizzes, you don't have to write the tests, you don't have to supervise the TAs, you just teach. And I was kind of like, you mean you just lecture? Because that's not teaching to me. So, I was kind of looking for the classes that are less important in some ways to the department, so I would have more freedom. But that's not really a strategy for institutional change. And I think that's a very real question. Because,
Although-
you know, I can do things in my niche, but it doesn't really help the students if it's not programmatic in a bigger way.
So it might be true though, if you can find a course that other people don't care about as much and you can go do it there, and then you can use that to point to, look, it's working here.
Yeah.
Again, be useful.
Well, what I have found though, because I'm talking to people and look, you know, nobody sat down and said, wow, I think lecturing with 3 midterms and a final is the best way to teach. And that's why we do it. I mean, you know, people laugh when you say that. And I think, you know, particularly with the pandemic, I think a lot of other folks realize that there are problems. And I mean, I would really like to disrupt gatekeeping in introductory math. And I mentioned that it's a department meeting, and you know, actually people agreed with that, which was really surprising to me. So I think some of the issue is, somebody said this before, but just kind of about inertia and, you know, not wanting to put the time into learning a different way to do that. And that's why I'm just intrigued by, you know, can we just suggest ways to change the assessment system and some of the kinds of things that all of the other panelists have done to teach that to new people, you know, to make it not so hard to start that and to not say you have to change your pedagogy. You know, maybe there's an opening there.
Can I say something about this? Because I got specs grading off the ground at Clemson University by putting on workshops on it. And of course, faculty came from, you know, all over the university, but I did it repeatedly. I would do something at the workshop, but I would have a faculty member who'd adopted specs grading to really talk about how he or she had done it. So you might go to your local teaching center and ask them to do that and say, well, hey, I'll do most of the workshop. And the director will like you for that.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea.
I also think results speak for themselves. So if you can take results that other people have gotten, like our big result that we've gotten is that we took students who traditionally, to get through our remediation program, the completion rate was something like 9%. And then when they got to the course that this used to be, it still had only a 60% pass rate. So you're talking about 6% of students finishing the funnel. We've now got, well, pre-pandemic, 70 or 80% of students finishing the funnel. So, you know, those statistics mean something, especially to university administrators.
All right, and then also speaking of those results, just because I know them a little bit, Sylvia or Sharona, will you also talk about some of the other data that you guys have seen from your program since this redesign, especially with some of the equity gaps that were seen before the redesign?
Sylvia, do you want to take that or you want me to take it?
You can go take that.
Well, the key thing is, you know, again, this big, huge redesign that happened across 23 campuses with 500,000 students, there's a lot of attention by the chancellor's office on our equity gaps. So male, female, for which understanding acknowledgement to the non-binary situation, but our institution still tracks male, female. Underrepresented minority, which is typically the Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then also our first generation gap. We closed all of them to almost nothing. So not only did we raise everybody up, sort of that lifting all the boats, but we saw a closure, a statistically significant closure to essentially no difference in almost all the gaps. I think the only one we still had left was African-American males. But since we are over 80% Hispanic, we did have a very small sample size on the African-American males. But that was, again, when getting change, results often speak for themselves, especially in this land of equity attention.
All right, thank you.
Can I just ask follow up? Have you published that somewhere?
I don't think it hasn't been published like in a reviewed journal. I know that there've been some reports coming out of our system. I think we're looking at doing that. The problem is the pandemic threw some wrenches into the whole thing, because unfortunately our particular course did see a pass rate drop when the pre-calculus did not, and I have my suspicions as to why that happened, because we're still holding to some very high, not easy to cheat on standards and assessments. But it's not published yet. I'm sure it's something that Sylvia and Boslia and I have thought about, but have not yet gone that direction. But we have seen all the internal reports.
I think it would
Although
be
we have
helpful to
presented,
others.
Sharona and I have presented some of these at the National Numeracy Network. And I know that is one of the places that before everything kind of fell apart a year and a half ago, that was one of the places that we were starting to look at for publication. All right, I have another question that's actually several questions. So this is to the entire panel, but feel free to answer any part or parts. So the question comes from Chloe. First question is, how did you decide whether to do assessments or reassessments in a class or out of class? How do you do extra time accommodations or excused absences? And how much do these add to the complexity of the logistics? So again, really deep question, several parts. Feel free to answer any or all. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Well, so our setup was that we had an untimed out of class assignment that was a bit more on the explorative side. So I'd have the first try at it. Then we had a quiz just to make sure that you did it yourself, accountability. And so we did used to have the quizzes and the re-quizzes in class. And that was in part just to keep versions from floating around. When we went into the pandemic, what we did, we sliced up our quizzes by individual standards, and then the time for that was not long enough to post things and check and get answers. So, which was something that we saw in the fall when we first had outside assignments. So the pandemic had whole wrench putting into this. However, what we've learned from the pandemic is that we may well make some of the quizzes and re-quizzes available online with a larger window in order to not use up all the time. So what we've done basically is we had the initial quiz during the class time, and then re-quizzes, which are, depending on whether you need them or not, we think of having them outside of class. And then accommodations, excused absences. Well, in absent participation and being in class counts in this P-cubed standard, that's sort of the conformity standard. And there's a lot of extra points, that being the only point standard, that if you miss something, it's not going to really count against you unless you start doing a lot of missing. And I think that's
and again, just to follow a little bit on that, as we think about pivoting back, some of our classes are going to be in person, some are going to be online. I still have to coordinate both. So at least in the short term for the coordinators, our quizzes and re-quizzes are probably still going to be handled through Canvas within a 48-hour window. Students can take them, they can use class time for the main quizzes, because we don't want to burden shift the time completely outside of the class time, because we think that's inequitable. But then re-quizzes, which are to the advantage of the students, we're not going to leave class time aside. What's great about doing your quizzes on Canvas, though, is we can handle all of the extra time accommodations inside Canvas. There are settings where we can assign extra time. And again, if we have students who have work conflicts or things in short periods, we can adjust due dates. Mostly a lot of the excuses are just like, well, we make a note of it. This is what we tell the students. We're making a note that you missed this quiz. Go ahead and take the re-quiz. And at the end of the semester, if you still need an extra opportunity, then we'll look at it then. And so we basically shift the burden of those makeups to the end. And I don't think I've ever had a student who still needs one after the second or third they're either getting it or they're not at that point. So it actually, the pandemic piece has simplified the logistics tremendously, and we're going to try to maintain a lot of that moving forward.
So ours are all outside of class, mostly because they're on a computer. We don't want to tell students they have to bring a computer with them to class. Let's see, again, the gateway system through WebWork also allows us to just set up for extended time very easily and to extend deadlines if a student is sick during that week. The other thing that I found really useful about mastery grading is that since I'm not just like making an exam and then if a student misses it, I have to make another exam that's comparable somehow, but it's different. It's like, I know what things I'm trying to assess. And so I make another problem that very clearly assesses that same thing. And so it's much easier to deal with finding out if students know the material that they missed because you are assessing much more clearly very specific things.
All right.
I would just say, I'm sorry, one more thing on that. When you're doing these large classes, this is exactly the questions you need to ask though. I mean, this took planning and screwing up. Things like when we started doing this 48-hour window, one of the challenges with 48-hour windows is we have class time scheduled all day, every day in different structures because our classes either meet 3 times a week or 2 times a week. So we had to schedule it so that we overlapped every class. Well, we accidentally missed a class one semester. Like it just wasn't in the time period. And we had a student who said, look, my time for this class is during class. So we do try to make sure that our periods cover at least one class period of every section, which is why we can't do less than 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So
kind of a follow-up question, although not directly related to our topic, but it is related to part of your answer, Sharona. And this is to the whole panel though, is how much of the work that you've done during the pandemic do you plan to keep post-pandemic?
As much as possible. The big thing that we really want to do is people want to come back into the classroom. So we were already in a flipped classroom, iClicker heavy active learning setting because we could. iClickers have proven to be less effective than I would like in the pandemic. So I think many of our instructors, because one of the things with iClickers is it's really great to let students try to click their answer in and then get into a group and discuss, and you just couldn't do that well in the Zoom environment. So I think coming back in and bringing in the classroom environment is going to be important. But a lot of the assessment, I'm hoping that we'll keep much of it in Canvas because it tremendously simplifies my life as a coordinator. Because beforehand, I had to design 7 versions because every time period had to have its own version. And then I had to get them into instructors' boxes and make copies. And I would literally I have a key to the department only because I have to go in and make copies at 7 a.m. So, so that hopefully is not going to go back.
Yeah, and I mean, our changes were pre-pandemic, so we're keeping them. There's some changes actually that I wanted to make that the pandemic disrupted it because we had to shift to thinking about teaching online and stuff that I'm looking forward to getting back to. Things about those written exams, making them more mastery-ish.
Go ahead, Debbie, please.
Yeah, so this was very stark for me. It wasn't in one of my really big classes, but I was teaching 2 sections of linear algebra. So I guess if you put them together, maybe it counts because I had 65 students or something like that in the semester that we went remote. And I had made this system that had, it had procedural quizzes, conceptual quizzes, and application quizzes. Okay. And I was drowning. I mean, it was just like way too many quizzes. Like, even if we would have stayed in person, I was going to have to do something. I mean, I had all these color-coded folders and, I would make these notes about 10 different things, like how many of them did I have to photocopy? And so I actually, the first week, we didn't get any planning time. It was the middle of spring break. We found out we were going. So I just had meetings with the students, kind of midterm to get suggestions. And a lot of the students said, why don't you could we work together on the conceptual quizzes? And I just decided to try that. And so, I was in breakout rooms with them having these really rich discussions of linear algebra, and I started making them a lot harder. And then I was thinking, I was using the discussion section every week to give quizzes. And I was like, why was I doing that, pedagogically? So I thought there would be a lot of cheating. I just had the quizzes up on Blackboard. They took it and it was just rewriting the same quiz. And I don't think there was a lot. I mean, I got really nervous at the end. Some people had procrastinated and turned in a bunch at the end, but they made the same kind of mistakes that everybody made on their first draft. So I was really surprised by that. And I mean, I think I had done a good job of selling linear algebra as something you should really want to know. And they said they were helping their friends in other sections because they actually understood it because of the active learning. So that's just one example. I really can't say anything from the stats class because I never did it in person. The Miro whiteboards that I showed, though, I found a lot of really good things with that, and is a way to keep group work from one class to the next. And a lot of students said they'd want to keep doing that.
Were you wanting to jump in, Sylvia?
Well, I was just trying to find out, Debbie, what kind of whiteboards were those?
Oh, it's called Miro. I can put the link. I mean, for me, so another thing that I didn't mention, for all my STEM major classes, for all my other classes except for the stats class, like half my students were in China during the pandemic. And so one of the things that I started using Miro was just, it's not blocked in China. And I can show you more about it. It's set up for corporate stuff, but there were really interesting things I found. Like, for example, this was in a smaller class, but I had certain things where they wanted to have a discussion, and they could post anonymous, they posted little Post-it notes, but they were actually anonymous, which would be really hard to do in a room. And then I would roll a die and pick a student and say, well, just pick one that you're interested in, and say why you're interested in it. And then that student would talk and say why they said it. This was in a liberal arts math class, but it was just a really interesting thing. And that really got the students from the US and the students from China talking to each other, which can be a challenge. So that's just an example there. I think that there were a lot of things that solved problems that I didn't realize I had, because, it was like, oh, wow, once you just embrace it and see, okay, what can I do in this new medium? And just to bring it back, that's what I was trying to say about the large class, okay, which I still think is a really bad model, but I think there must be other things you can do. I mean, like we had a lot more office hours, having so much staff, for example, and we had them at different times. So I don't know, I'm just trying to understand the strengths of the structure and the medium.
Just something I wanted to add in general, especially if you're working with other instructors who are subject to RTP. One of the things that our instructors were initially nervous about, and we had to address, and we have, which is, especially in a coordinated course, this is probably less of an issue with graders, but if they don't have control over the course and yet students don't like something, they were afraid of being held accountable for something that they don't have control over. So we have contract addenda that go in their files that say, hey, RTP people, this is the part that the instructor has no say over. So you can get mad at the coordinators in their RTP, but you can't blame the instructors. And that helped a lot for our instructors to feel like they were protected. And that was really super important for us.
Shredder, can you real quick, for anyone that doesn't use that acronym, can you explain what?
Oh, retention, tenure, and promotion. So, definitely in the tenure line, you know what that is. But for adjuncts at our institution, we have to do annual or every other year binders where they evaluate us, and we have to submit syllabi and graded work, and they have to look at our exams. And if you're in one of these coordinated courses, you don't have the authority to write your exams, at least in ours, and some of the other coordinated courses they do. So, again, on that inclusiveness and equity, we also have to protect our instructors. And everyone was asking me, do I get to sign this addendum? And I'm like, no, I don't get to sign this because I write the assessments. So if people want to get mad at me, but it is really important, I think, when you're working with instructors, to show them, just as I sort of treat the instructor group as a class on top of a class. It's like I'm training them, which is what I'm up to, and then they're working with students. And so I want to treat them with the same humanity that I want to show to my students.
Yeah. And since, so this didn't have to do so much with the mastery grading, but just with the coordination and the level of coordination that we imposed, that when it's like the syllabus, well, I didn't make the syllabus, there's a syllabus template, etc. So that's something to think about when you have coordinated courses, no matter what kind of system you use, but especially if it's something that students might complain about because they're not used to it.
All right, so looking at the time, we do only have about 5 minutes left. So I want to take a minute first to thank all 4 of the ladies on the panel. Great discussion in the chat. So I want to thank you participants, some great questions and great discussion in the chat. Let me. Sorry, my share is not working. There we go. Just wanted to make sure everyone knows what's up next. At the conclusion of this, we will have a 15-minute tea break. So until 4:30 Eastern time, at which time we will be coming back to the large town hall Q&A session. So with that, if you have any other last minute questions that you would like to, please stick around and ask our panel. Otherwise, thank you guys all for such a great session and a lively chat and discussion.
I would just say, guys, this can be done. It can. You can do this in large classes and in coordination. You can do it, and we're here to help. But use your technology. You have to use your technology.
Yeah.
Yes, and again, if you haven't already, please do join the Slack community, especially if you're wanting additional supports with how to do these large coordinations.
And we'll see you at the town hall. Please join us. It's going to be really great, important conversations.
And then, Sharona, do you want to turn the record off?
Yes, I will do that.